Welcome back, you guys. This is part 3 of a series of conversations around crucial conversations and crucial accountability with Murray Lowe, my dad, who is a trainer in this and has years of experience teaching, implementing, coaching people on these truly difficult conversations. And today we get into accountability and the skills that go into the actual conversation. So we talked about some of the prep work and the mindset work leading up to these conversations in previous interviews. Now we're going to talk about some of the logistics of the actual conversation with people. And there's 2 different books: Crucial Conversations, Crucial Accountability. The difference being crucial conversation kind of applies in any direction, whether it's with a spouse or a boss or a coworker or someone below you. Crucial accountability is where there's this dynamic of you are holding someone accountable. And usually that's in like a boss type relationship. So if you have anyone that you lead on a team and you need to hold them accountable, that's the difference between them. It's not so much holding yourself accountable, it's holding other people accountable. So I think you guys will really enjoy this interview, and we'll talk to you on the backside. Welcome back to the Shared Practices podcast. Murray Lowe, this is your 4th time on the show. Thank you for coming on.
Oh, love being on the show and love talking about what I care most deeply about, which is how do we get people on the same page? That sounds easy in theory, but getting people on the same page is extremely difficult in real life, right?
Okay, let's get into this. We had talked about foundations of having difficult conversations last time. And now we wanted to circle back to how do we hold people accountable? So I think a very common circumstance in a dental office is that a dentist sees something that shouldn't be happening, whether it's an assistant who doesn't have a supply ready for them. And then this happens again, and they've trained about this previously, they've talked about it, they bring it up at meetings, and it continues to not happen. Or any aspect of someone showing up late consistently. There's a lot of times where there's this sense of, okay, I think they know they shouldn't be doing this, and I thought that I communicated that. Now they're not doing it. Crap! What do I do? How do I hold this person accountable? Do I stay quiet? Do I get mad? Am I supposed to get mad? Is that supposed to, am I supposed to show emotion so they know that I'm serious? Um, and I think a lot of dentists hold it in. A lot of dentists let it out and explode. And there's a few that have found some skillful ways to deal with situations like this. So that's kind of the conversation I'm hoping to have today. How does that sound?
That sounds great. And I think most dentists, most people, when they approach these conversations, have a default mode. And the default mode is either bribes or threats. That's what we learn. We see parents all the time do that with their kids. If I can't get them to do what they want, I either have to bribe them or threaten them. I'll threaten them with punishment or bribe them with some reward. And those are exactly the wrong responses, because bribes or threats only work temporarily. And I'll give you a quick example. I remember when one of our daughters was playing piano and wasn't practicing the piano, right? And came up one day and said, "Practicing is no fun." And so typically
it's not. I just want to clarify.
Well, it's not. And yeah, I know that. And so usually what you do is you say, well, we're paying all this money and investing all this time and energy. And, it's a little bit of a threat and a guilt trip. We're investing all this time and energy in this, and you ought to do it because we're providing you this opportunity. Or we'll take away your screen time. No video game, we'll take away your cell phone time, or whatever. Or we'll give you some kind of a reward if you do this. And those solutions are temporary. It provides no lasting ability to make change. Because what you want in an accountability conversation is you want people to change. And in fact, you want people to want to take action and to want to come in on time, to want to get all the stuff ready for a procedure and have it there when it's there, not feeling like they're obligated to, or they're going to get in trouble if they don't, or somehow they'll get an extra reward if they do. You want people to genuinely connect and share your priorities. The goal in an accountability conversation is, how do I get people to share my priorities? I've had people all the time who say, the people who work for me just don't care like I care. And oftentimes as a small business owner, you care deeply. I mean,
It's almost impossible for anyone to care at the same level, but you at least want like 80% of that.
I tell people all the time, I'll tell small business owners, I say, yeah, actually, your people do care. They just don't care about what you care about.
Mm.
So everyone cares deeply about something. How do I get them to care more deeply about the things that are important to this practice and important to this business? And that's the goal around an accountability conversation. And while it sounds easy in theory, it's really, really difficult. At the end of the conversation, you want three things. So three different outcomes. Number one, you want some kind of a change. You want them to show up on time, or you want them to be doing, getting the stuff ready for the procedure. So you want a change in behavior. Secondly, in accountability conversation, you want to learn more about either the other person or the business in a way that you didn't know about it before. There are reasons why people aren't coming in on time or why they're not getting those things. And you want to learn those reasons. You want to discover the underlying root cause. And so if you're having an accountability conversation and using threats or bribes, you don't learn. There's no learning that happens there. And the third thing is you want to significantly enhance your relationship. You want to create a connection with that person. So that they know not only that you want them to care about what you care about, but they understand at a very deep level that you care about them deeply as an individual and a human being and about their priorities. And so if you can get the connection part, you can't get the result part unless you get the connection and the learning part, and you can't get the learning part unless you get the connection part. So you asked, do I get mad at people? Well, that's a threat. That's a type of a threat or a bribe. If you want compliance, if you want people to do what you say when you want it, then yes, get mad at people. But you're not creating a connection, and you're not learning about your business or about that individual, and not only about that individual, but one of the fundamental questions that I've been thinking about for 30 years is, why do people do what they do? Why do people come in late day after day after day after day, despite requests, training, teaching, threats, bribes? Part of becoming a small business owner is becoming a psychologist, becoming really getting to connect with people and helping them understand why it's in their best interest to be doing what you're asking them to do. And that's how they share your priorities. Again, sounds really easy. It's extremely complicated because for each person, it's going to be different, right? So no two individuals are alike. And you may have a different personality than the person you're asking to do this. There are some personalities who like to get things done. They like to be, they get there early and they make things happen without you ever asking. There are other people that don't have those personalities. So, I mean, if you want to, you could burn through enough staff so you get people who only are the can do, do it kind of people. However, I don't think the world is full enough of those types of people that you can get by that way. You're going to go through a lot of people, because everyone in a job interview is going to tell you, I'm a can-do person. I can make things happen. I never come late. I'm responsible. I take initiative. I anticipate your needs. That's always going to be part of the job interview. So you're never going to get away from that. So you can then just, okay, well, let's just burn through people until we get the right kind of folks here. Or actually, maybe these people do have some skills, and maybe they can teach me some things about my business and about my leadership style and about how to connect with people and how to motivate people that I haven't thought about yet. So part of it is going in with a different attitude. An accountability conversation is an opportunity to learn about people, opportunity to learn about your business, and an opportunity to change. And all those are wonderful opportunities.
So I love this. So I wanted to summarize. So if you come in with threats, it's like, you better do this or we're going to fire you. You might get temporary results, but it might come at a cost of long-term results. It might come at a cost of missed information about that person and about your business that you could be doing better. It might come at a cost of that relationship, kind of harming and damaging your relationship long-term. The same thing with bribes. You might get temporary results, but you've missed an opportunity to learn and to connect. And if you can do this skillfully, then you can get all three. The thing that came to mind, and I'm trying to throw out doubts because this is, maybe what people are going to be thinking when they're listening is, if I come in curious, I'm going to hear a bunch of excuses. Like when you said maybe you might learn something about your business, you might learn something about this person. Um, a lot of times it's like, if I come in and I'm like, well, I want to find out why they were late, they're going to tell me all of these excuses. And if I buy into those excuses, then maybe I'm not doing my job as a business owner or as a manager to hold people accountable. So, talk to me about that, about this idea of the first thing when you try and hold someone accountable. I feel like that's the next thing that comes out is like, well, here's this, and this.
And that is a totally valid perspective, because there's a very fine line between reasons and excuses. And what you want people to do is to understand that I really do want to understand reasons, but I really don't want to understand excuses. I work with a guy named Carey Patterson, who's one of the authors of Crucial Accountability. And he used to say to me, he'd say, Murray, there's a formula for that poor performers use to, in their minds, justify their poor performance. And it's a mathematical equation. And the mathematical equation says on one side, good results, and there's an equals sign, equals bad results plus a good excuse. So a lot of people believe that if they have a good excuse, then it's the same as having good results, because they have a reason why, they have that excuse why that doesn't happen. So that's an interesting thing to think about when it comes to people. Yeah. So what you need to do when you're having this accountability conversation is try and differentiate between the reasons and the excuses. And this is where the humanity and there's what I call the science and the skill of having an accountability conversation and the art of having a conversation. Because many of those excuses are just simply that. They're just excuses. And usually the reason people have excuses is to take ownership off of them. The excuse is a way to throw ownership back at someone else, and to not take responsibility. In fact, I talk about some employees are like Teflon. You talk to them, holding them accountable, and all of a sudden they kind of turn sideways and it just slides off. And so when you see that, you've got to deal with that. I remember a situation and you would do this as a teenager. I remember coming home one day saying, "Hey, Rich, you didn't mow the lawn like I asked you to do today, and it's summertime. You didn't have a summer job. You weren't working. I go to work in 12 hours, come home, the lawn's not done. Well, Dad, you didn't do this for me last week." And
did I really do that?
Absolutely. And so, and I use this example all the time. One of the accountability conversations that you may need to be holding with people is people who never take ownership or responsibility for anything. You bring up stuff, they throw it back in your face. Your tactics are very common. They'll throw it back in your face. They might distract you. You would say, "Hey, let's talk about Lord of the Rings or Star Wars." You talk about something or Harry Potter, something I was interested in. So they'll divert you. They'll change the subject. They'll throw it back in your face. They'll get angry. They'll cry. So these are tactics that people use in the face of an accountability conversation to get away from taking ownership of their poor performance, right? Good results equals bad results plus a good excuse. So when you see that happening, that actually might be your accountability conversation. Is that I notice when I try and talk to you about issues that you'll put it back on me, you'll change the subject, you'll get upset and not take ownership for what's happening, what's going on. So sometimes the accountability is around how you're communicating and how you're effectively relating to one another. So great. It's a great objection or a great concern. And when you see someone doing that, just using excuse after excuse after excuse, that's the accountability conversation you have with them.
Well, I feel like there was like tiers to the conversation you were having. So it's like you could come in and you could have a conversation about the issue at hand. You could have a conversation about a pattern, or you could have a conversation about the relationship. So it's like if someone comes in late, it's their first time holding them late, you have a conversation, they have an excuse about their kid, about traffic, about weather.
Yeah.
There's something that realistically came up, and wasn't part of their normal plan. They were late. You had the conversation. You kind of took it at face value and you moved on. And they knew that it was still important that you had the conversation because they knew that you were watching and that you were going to talk to them if they weren't performing at the level that you expected. But the conversation kind of ends there. So what do you do if instead of it being a one-time incident where you're kind of having it at the excuse or the reason level and now it's become a pattern? How does that
Sure.
change the accountability?
And actually, let me
Or
let me.
should we take some step back? Like, do we want to
No,
approach
no.
this from like how do we have an accountability conversation overall?
Well, the first thing, the first mistake that people make having an accountability conversation is they talk about the same thing over and over and over again. They live in Groundhog Day. And according to Einstein, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result, right? So,
Right.
so it's interesting. If you were, take one of your friends from dental school, and you're talking to her or him about something that's going on, and assume they've joined a dental practice and they're working with a dentist, and they've been promised ownership, and after a couple of years, it's not happening. And so they're talking to you. You're having a one-on-one. They're going to be totally honest with you, and you get together with that person. You say, "So tell me what's happening. Why are you so frustrated?" The first thing a lot of people tell you is, "Well, it's complicated." Right? There's not one problem. There's a whole mass of issues that are going on with this dentist. One is the dentist making promises that they're not keeping. Two is they're making changes to the agreement around billing and other things. There are all these different things that are happening. And so what we say with accountability conversations is you need to simplify the conversation and focus on one thing. And that's what you're getting to, so that you don't live in Groundhog Day. In fact, we tell people, if you ever have the same conversation twice, you've had the wrong conversation. You should never, ever, ever, ever have the same conversation twice. Because there are levels of conversation. There's a way to parse this or take a conversation and separate it into manageable pieces. And I'll use a quick example. And Rich, this is another thing about you. I'm going to tell things about you.
I love it.
I've told this to 15,000 people. But so I'll just pretend like
here's another 15,000.
There we go. So when the day you turn 16, we go to the DMV in Lawrence, pick up your driver's license. On the way home, I was like, "Dad, can I use the car on Friday night?" He said, "Sure, Rich. Just understand we've only got 2 rules. Rule number 1 is driving is not a right; it's a privilege. So you've got to be in by midnight. Rule number 2 is if you can't be in by midnight, then call and let us know." And you say, "Fine," right? So first Friday night, you go out. Nadine and I are like traumatized. You're our oldest. We're worried about you. 12:15, Nadine's like, "Where's Richard? Some drunk drivers." It's like, no. Let's figure out what's wrong. So you come in at 12:20, and I say, "Rich, you're late and you didn't call. What happened? I'm really worried about you." It's like, "Oh, Dad, you're not going to believe this. We went to Steak and Shake after the movie, and there were like 10 of us, and we were in this big group, and then they got our orders mixed up, and they wouldn't do the separate bills. And it took us like 45 minutes to get out of the stupid restaurant because our server wasn't helpful, and someone didn't bring enough money."
This was pre-cell phone days. Just to add to my excuses, I couldn't have just texted or called from my cell phone. I would have had to like ask for Steak and Shake's phone.
It was right about that time. You might have had.
I didn't have one until I was 18.
Okay.
You might have to modify this story now. That's okay. Keep going. Let's go with your version.
Okay, so my story is different than yours. It's like, okay, good. Well, next Friday night, you ask for the car. I remind you of the 2 things. Say, just call or be in by midnight. Let us know if you can't be in by midnight. Anyway, you come back. No call. 12:30. All of a sudden, you come back, and I hear you go, "Rich, you're late, and you didn't call." Now, I always ask people, okay, what have I just done? I told you a couple minutes ago you're never supposed to do what? Have the same conversation twice. And I've just said the exact same thing. You're late and you didn't call, but this time I'm mad, right? I'm a little pissed off. I'm upset at you.
Right.
And you're like, "Oh, Dad, I had to take Kira home, and I couldn't go in at her place and the cell phone coverage is bad there. I couldn't call you from her house. So it's like, I don't care. If this happens again, there'll be consequences. So third Friday night, you ask again. I remind you, is your final chance. You're going to get grounded if you don't do this. So at any rate, midnight rolls around, no sun, 12:30, no sun. 1:00, I hear the garage door open. And now I go in our back entrance, the back hallway. And when you open the door, I say, Rich, you're late. You didn't call. You're grounded. No more car for a month. Dad, I can't believe it. I went to Lord of the Rings. It was a 3-hour movie. And then I brought my friends home. I took them home as quick as I could. I couldn't jump in and give you a call. I can't believe it. I said, no, you're grounded. And he said, you're such a crappy parent. He said something like that, right? and I wait.
Yeah, I don't remember any of this. This is great.
The interesting thing about this is I'm having the wrong conversation, right? And this gets to the situation of, hey, there are levels of conversation, and what this illustrates are the various different levels. And we use a scale. It says, look, if you're going to have an accountability conversation, you can step up to it at 3 different levels. This allows you to break it into small and manageable pieces. And we use an acronym in accountability called CPR. So the first level is called the content. So the first time someone's late, you talk about it at the content level. So you're late. Someone doesn't come into your practice, talk to them about it. The problem with content is the land of exceptions or land of excuses. There's always a reason why someone's late. Again, this is back to the formula, good results equals bad results plus a good excuse. There's always an excuse for people. But the second time it happens, you go to a deeper level, which is called the pattern level. So the second Friday night, instead of saying, hey, you're late, you didn't call, repeating the conversation, I'm going to talk about a pattern. Because if I say to you, so second Friday night, I'm going to verbalize this. So how to verbalize CPR is very interesting. So instead of saying you're late and you didn't call, I would say, hey, Rich, there's a pattern of you being late and not calling. What's going on with this pattern? And then what people typically do is they like, oh, well, Dad, I had to take Kira home. And you know how bad, things getting there. I said, no. What people do is they pull you back to content, because content is a line of excuses. They want a leg to stand on. So if someone's habitually late or someone's habitually not delivering, talk about it at that level, at what we call the pattern level. Talk about a pattern of behaviors you're seeing. And don't bring it back to individual instances, because every time you bring it back to an individual instance, they'll have kind of an excuse to work.
They're going to want to pull back to the excuse content level every single time.
Exactly.
But you're having a deeper conversation about, yes, there was circumstances last time, there were circumstances this time, but overall, there's a pattern that we're seeing here.
Yeah, and I would say rather than but overall, and overall, don't use the word but, and overall, and overall, okay. What's going on with this pattern? Now, the third Friday night, you went downstairs, you stormed down to your room, you're upset. I couldn't go to sleep. I stayed up for 2 hours, and I realized I didn't ground you because you were late and didn't call. There was a deeper reason, right? And so why do you think I grounded you? And I ask people this. I say, why did I ground my son? Why did I ground you, do you think?
I think you grounded me because you felt like I didn't respect you. You couldn't trust me. I wasn't listening. And I don't know, there's like a gap between us at this point. It's getting frustrating.
Exactly. Well, yeah, you're blowing me off. You're 16 and you think, you know what? I'm 16. I can drive. I don't have to listen to my parents anymore. I'm an adult. I can do whatever I want. And there's a lack of respect there. So yeah, the real reason I grounded you wasn't because you were late. It was because you felt like you didn't have to respect your parents' authority anymore. And so that's the R are relationship issues. And there are a number of relationship issues. The 3 most common are respect, the one we talked about there, trust, and competence. So oftentimes we're trying to have an accountability conversation with someone who isn't getting things done, when the reality is maybe we think they're blowing us off, or maybe we don't trust them anymore, or maybe we don't think they're capable of doing their job. Now, I'll just give you a couple of examples. The first example, I had a guy who was reporting to me. When I first went through accountability training, I had a problem with one of my guys who was just like what you described. He was the land of a million excuses. No matter what needed to happen, he would come up with an excuse when it wouldn't happen. And it got to the point, it was so bad where I would give him an assignment, and the thought that would go through my head immediately was, he's not going to get it done. And so what I would do is instead of talking about it, which oftentimes what happens in our practices, instead of talking about issues that are problems, we do a workaround. We think, okay, if this person's not going to have it ready, then I'll maybe have this other person check up on them, or I'll do this or that. And so we end up doing workarounds so things don't fall between the cracks, which in the end up creating more work for other people and frustrating other people and letting that person off the hook. So you don't want to do that. So I remember I went through this training and we talked about CPR, and I realized I didn't trust him anymore. The issue wasn't the fact that he wasn't getting, there was a pattern and he wasn't getting the work done, but he would tell me he would get it done and then he wouldn't do it. So that ended up being the conversation I had with him. I had an accountability conversation with him about that. And do you mind if I share that with you?
Sure. Yeah, I'd love that.
Yeah. So it was interesting because I spent a little bit of time preparing this. Again, understanding that number one, I want things to happen. I want things to change. Number two, I want to learn about people and I want to learn about what's happening in the business potentially. And number three, I want a closer relationship. So I went through the entire process and I brought him in my office. I said, Corey, I just want to have an honest and open conversation, one that's different than we've ever had before. And he said, that's fine. And I said, great. Well, Corey, I want you to know I love working with you and appreciate all the stuff you do. And for the last 3 or 4 months, every time I give you an assignment, a thought runs through my head. And the thought is that you're not going to get it done. And that doesn't make me feel too comfortable. It's not really working well. I need to know what's happening. Do you think, Corey, because I'm your boss, that you just have to say yes, even if you are not going to do it? Or am I not being clear about what I'm asking you to do? Or, and this is what I really thought, I said, Corey, are you really telling me yes, but meaning no, and then hoping that I'm going to forget and not follow up? I just want you to be straight with me. What's going on? Now, there was a pause, and it seemed like it was 10 seconds. It's probably 3 or 4 seconds. And he leaned back and he goes, well, Murray, I got to tell you, I'm depressed. Now, when he told that to me, he's like, oh, holy crap. Oh, okay. All of a sudden,
you didn't see this coming.
I didn't see this coming, but the world made sense. It's like, oh, well, that explains it. That's, of course, he's not getting anything done because he's depressed. Huh. And in the company I worked with, we have what's called an employee assistance program. And there's a very specific steps you take to talk people through. You want to understand their depression and you want them to get help and you commit them to do that. So, that takes a little while. So we kind of veered away from the accountability conversation and we dealt with his depression, which sometimes you actually have to do in an accountability conversation. You may have to deal with a more important issue. And if that's the case, then deal with it, right? You can't just push that aside.
And that's kind of where you talked about the art of this is knowing when something they bring up is an excuse versus a real reason, and something that, like this, that he's kind of opening up to you and sharing what could be, maybe he was worried he'd get fired. Maybe he was worried about all these other things, but he's trusting you enough to share kind of what's going on.
Exactly. And he finally did, as opposed to just telling. A lot of times people tell people what they want to hear, particularly people who have more authority than them. As a practice owner, you have more authority than people, and people get used to deferring to authority. That's just that's default mode that we've all learned. When mom and dad, when your boss says to do something, you jump how high on the way up. And so that is default mode, particularly in the corporate workplace, because people realize that if you don't default to authority, then that, you get labeled troublemaker, you lose your job, etc. So it's just easier. It's easier to default and say, yep, whatever you say is fine. You're the boss. I'm going to do it. That's easier than actually bringing up what's really happening. So back to Corey, we talked about, through his depression, we developed a very concrete action plan where he was going to get some help with his depression, including to the point where, he had the name and a phone number of a therapist, someone he could go see. And we had a follow-up time to make sure that would actually happen. I wanted to make sure that he got that addressed. But then I came back and I said, Corey, your job description includes these 7 main duties that I count on you to make happen. How do you feel about doing this? Is this something that you can manage? He said, Murray, I can't handle it. I said, okay, that makes sense. And so he ended up taking a reduced role. And having fewer responsibilities, and kind of took a demotion in the organization. And at the end of that conversation, we had a better result and a better relationship. So, an accountability conversation, you get better results and better relationships. Better results in the sense that fewer things are going to fall between the cracks because we've got something he can manage, and I can bring in someone new to do that. And better relationship in the fact that we have a more honest and open communication. In fact, so that conversation was 17 years ago, and to this day, through the world of social media, I stay connected to Corey. He's moved all over the place, and he was an interesting guy. I mean, Corey grew up in L.A. And then in his 20s he moved to Hawaii, and he moved to Indianapolis in his 30s. In September, and he was depressed by March. And what's the difference between a winter in Indianapolis and a winter in Hawaii?
You never see the sun. I feel like we've entered full Indianapolis mode. It was about 2 months ago. I was like, well, this is how I remember it. It's just gray for a solid 3 or 4 months, it feels like.
Florida was invented to help people in the Midwest cope. So you just need to go to Florida and you'll be fine. But so having those accountability conversations at this point, this was a trust conversation. I don't trust you anymore. Now, I didn't pull Corey aside and say to him, what people typically say is, Corey, for 4 months I've been asking you to do things and you don't get them done. I just think you're lying to me, right? So that's the typical conversation, and that never goes well, because he's never going to open up. He's going to throw it back in my face. He might quit, But so having the right conversation allows you to understand more either about people and about your business, and also to have the kind of connection you need to have and to change the results you're looking for. Now, let me give you another quick example.
Okay.
And this is, so we talk about the toughest conversations are what I call trust, respect, and competence. And this is more of a personal example, but I was actually doing a workshop in San Francisco, and I described, the CPR model and how what we do is we believe that the easiest conversation to have is the content conversation. So you're late. Someone's late all the time. You keep talking about you're late. And you end up almost being like a nag, and you end up kind of owning the problem because you're nagging them to get on to be on time, and no one wants to be the nag, and it frustrates you because you have to nag them, and it frustrates them because they're being nagged and they know they're late. They're already feeling bad about being late, and the fact that they're being reminded of that, it's not helping at all. So it's not working for either one of you. So I talked about this concept of CPR, and this woman came to me during a break. She said, "This works. I did this weekend." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Well," and then people tell me interesting things. She said, I'm kind of in a crappy marriage. I'm a full-time breadwinner. My husband stays at home. He looks after the kids, but I get home and house is in a mess. Supper's not ready. So I kind of do everything. I raise the kids. I do all the housework, and I make the money. And he and I have been having some marital problems. And so she said, I felt like there's a song that's called, all the way around the mulberry bush, the monkey chased the weasel. And literally the monkey is chasing the weasel around this mulberry bush over and over and over again. And she felt like I was just chasing him around this table over and over. And the faster I would chase, the faster he would run. And then she said, she said, I'd never been to any accountability training. She said, I realized I needed to talk to him in a different way. And she said, I sat him down. I said, honey, I want to sit down. I want to talk to you about something very differently. She said, I didn't get mad at him that the dishes weren't done or the food wasn't ready and the house was a mess. I sat down with him on a little bit of a separate time. And I said to him, honey, I'm worried. I'm not sure that you're a great husband, and nor are you a very good father.
Oh, that's how she led?
That's how she led.
Oh.
But here's what she said. She said, we didn't argue. He didn't run away. There was nowhere for him to run.
Right.
He's like, she could have talked about the fact that he hadn't cooked dinner for 4 weeks.
Right.
Or that
had a different conversation for once.
Right. And that's the beauty of it. So if you're going to have an accountability conversation, the first thing you got to know is you got to have the right conversation. And CPR is the tool you use to kind of break it into very manageable pieces. It was interesting because she said, we sat down, and for the first time, almost since we had children, we had an honest and open conversation. about his, he was like, well, I wasn't really sure I wanted to be a father, and I'm not all that skilled in terms of jobs, and I'm not all that, he got at the end of the conversation, he kind of said to her, he said, so you're telling me unless that I change, you're going to divorce me? And she said, yeah, you got it.
Wow.
So that's so finally they had an honest and open conversation. So if you're going to, accountability conversation is genuinely getting to the heart and getting into honest and open conversations. And there's a real skill set around talking about the right thing, but the other skill set is around how do you phrase it? What kind of emotions do you bring in? So when we were having this training, she's always upset, and if you're upset at people and you're nagging people, that they're never going to open up to you. So you have to come at it from a very different emotional perspective, and you have to come at it from a very different verbal perspective in order to make that succeed.
So, and this is where, and I don't know if we've said this, I don't think we have so far. So there are two different books. There is a book and a training course and a product called Crucial Conversations, and there's a whole separate book training skill set called Crucial Accountability. And there's a lot of overlap, but there's some differences. And the overlap, I feel like, is the skill of having difficult conversations in a safe way that builds relationships. That's the central skill. But there's different dynamics on either side, and then there's different nuances to the skill when you're the boss and holding someone accountable. Am I phrasing that correctly?
That's 100% correct. So, I mean, yes, the goal is to have this totally honest and open conversation in a way that improves results in relationships. The significant difference, however, is when you have an accountability conversation, you need to go to a deeper level of understanding. And I'm going to get back to the question, which is, why do people do what they do? That's a fundamental question that I've been looking at for 30 years now. Why do people behave the way they behave? And what you get into an accountability conversation is you get into a really detailed understanding of that. And the reason you're doing that is not to go to excuses, because sometimes when you look at that, you can think, oh, well, now they're just more excuses of why they're doing that. But you really are looking for genuine reasons. And so, one of the things you have in an accountability conversation is you diagnose why people are doing what they're doing. And we ask a diagnostic question. And the diagnostic question can be phrased in a couple of ways. One way to diagnose the question or to ask the question would be to say, well, did you not want to do it, or were you unable to do it? Or you'd say, was it just not an important priority for you, or was it just too hard? And
you're asking people this question when you're having the accountability conversation, and you can kind of tweak it to the circumstance, but you're straight up asking that.
Yeah, after you get into the beginning part, because what you're trying to do is understand. There's two fundamental reasons why people do what they do, and it's divided into two categories. We call one of them motivation, the other ability. Right? People do things because they want to do it, because it's enjoyable, it's pleasurable, it fits with who they are, and they do it because they can, because they have the capability, skill, and talent to make that happen. So, what we assume in an accountability conversation 9 times out of 10 is we commit what's called the fundamental attribution error. The fundamental attribution error says that people are lazy and they don't care enough. And people say, if my people just cared more, if this person just cared more, he or she would come in on time every day, or he would have the preparation ready for the procedure we're going to do. So the fundamental attribution error is, again, just saying people are lazy and they're unmotivated and they don't care. And the reality is more times than not, it's as much an ability issue as it is a motivation issue. So in crucial accountability, you want to genuinely understand, is this dealing with their ability to make it happen and perform? I.e., are they clear about what the steps are? Are they clear about how to do the steps? Do they again, you're mixing formulations to stick in people's mouths. Do they understand the chemistry and the timing and all the stuff that needs to happen for that? Or is it just not a high enough priority for them? And
so it's almost like a training and skills versus motivation and drive.
Yeah. And so in an accountability conversation, you need to determine, do I need to be a motivator here? Do I need and I've talked to many executives and many leaders, and for them, motivation means, do I need to light a fire under people? Which lighting a fire under people is a threat. It's like, so when I talk about, threats or bribes, they can be real subtle or they can be not so subtle. And most of the time when people want to light a fire under someone, it's an implied threat. No, but how do I genuinely motivate people? How do I get them to want to take action? And then when it's an ability issue, it's how do I help people really increase their capacity and capability and skill, even when they're facing difficult issues or problems or challenges. Because there's probably a way to teach everyone to do everything. I had a root canal last month, and my dentist, who's not an endodontist, said I couldn't get down to the end of two of your little what are those things called? Canals. Yeah, I couldn't get down to the end of those two canals. He said they look like they're calcified, and I'm thinking, is that a motivation or ability issue? Probably a motivation issue, because he was working on
a scope. I think it's an ability issue because he did not have a microscope. So
well, and he spent a lot of time. He said, "Oh, this procedure is going to take 90 minutes," and after 2 hours in the chair, we weren't done yet. So I think he wanted to make it happen.
Oh yeah,
but he couldn't. And more often than not, people don't perform not because they don't want to, it's because they couldn't make it happen. If someone's always late, you think, okay, do they have a childcare issue? Do they have a spouse who keeps them up, or a partner who keeps them up till all hours of the evening? Do they have a sleep disorder? Right? You start thinking about, okay, what's going on in their life that causes them to be late every day. That's not all about me. And so as you start to have these accountability conversations, you start to realize that it's about other people too, and not all about your success. And if you can help other people deal with their issues in a positive way, then they'll reciprocate and help you deal in your practice and make it more successful.
I love that. And this goes back to coming to the conversation with a curiosity rather than an assumption of that we know everything. So that second question of, is there something here I can learn about this person or about my business? Maybe you're the problem. Maybe someone else in your office is the problem. And by coming in and assuming, oh, they have a motivation or they have an ability, maybe there's even another component to it where someone else is getting in the way. And we miss out on that when we come in hot, lighting a fire, just ready to lay the law down. So I guess, would you classify like environment and other people? Is that the same as ability, or is that like its own separate category?
Well, for both motivation and ability, there are levels of motivation and ability. And this was actually developed by a social scientist named Albert Bandura. He studied at University of Iowa, then was a professor at Stanford University for, I think, over 60 years, a full professor at Stanford. He's actually from Alberta, Canada, probably, and is the most famous psychologist in the world today. As an aside, in 2000, if you went to PhD research around psychology and sociology, everybody would cite three people. They would cite Freud, and they would cite Skinner and Piaget. So if you know anything about psychology, they're like the Mount Rushmore of psychology.
So 20 years ago. These are the people.
And 10 years ago, that changed. Number one by far for the last 15 years has been Albert Bandura. And Albert Bandura developed a theory around self-efficacy, which is people do things because, number one, they can, and number two, because they're motivated to do that. People do things, they ask themselves two questions. Number one, can I do this? And number two, will it be worth it? And if they can do something and it's worth it, then they'll do it every time. So one of the questions the people in your practice need to be thinking about, if I've got someone who's not doing things, well, is it worth it to them? And what Bandura did, because it's not just psychology, it's social psychology, he recognized that you ask that question personally, can I do this? And personally, do I like this? Is this something I want to do? But it also happens socially. So socially, we ask, will other people provide me positive reinforcement for doing this? That's called social motivation. And then they add in social ability, which is, Do other people provide help and support and coaching and the things that I need to make it happen? So,
Mm.
so we actually, if you took a blank sheet of paper and you did a square and you put motivation on the top left side and ability on the right side, then you put in 2 lines, so you got 6 boxes. On the left side, you would put personal. So you have box 1 would be personal motivation, box 2 would be personal ability. Then the next one would be social. Box 3 would be social motivation, and box 4 would be social ability. And as an aside, I used to teach social motivation and ability before social media happened, and people would look at me with blank stares, like, "What are you talking about?" But for the last 8 or 9 years, you talk about social motivation and ability, they totally get it. They
Mm.
totally get. So that's something we understand today that we didn't understand 10 years ago. But there's a bottom piece of the model that Albert Bandura didn't get, that Kerry Patterson, who's the what I call the principal author of Crucial Accountability, added in, and that is there's structural motivation and structural ability. So the effect of things. So source 5 would be, are there carrots and sticks? Are there rewards? What kind of things would make me want to do this? Or would discourage me from doing this? That's, about what are the carrots and sticks? And then finally, what kind of things would make it easier for me to do this? So that's systems and processes and microscopes, right? And tools and technology,
Software and insurance
software.
companies that you're dealing with, and
Yeah, and so the world of management consulting, for the most part, and I was a management consultant 25 years ago. The world of management consulting often deals in systems and structures and processes, and I've worked with many companies where you go in and you put in a new strategy and you put in a new system and you do all these things, but you haven't addressed people and nothing changes, right? And
mm,
so we really focus in on, what are an accountability conversation is, what needs to happen with people so that they can change their behavior. And as you know, running a dental practice, you put in a new system, it can drive new behaviors. And it not done correctly, nothing will change.
right. So that could be bonuses, or that could be introducing new equipment, or a new way of we're doing things, and all of these factors are influencing the success of that one way or another.
And the human component influences the systems component and vice versa, right? And so, there are times when systems and processes and structures can overwhelm humans, and other times when the human element totally overwhelms us. So yeah, there's a connection. So that's why when you look at why people don't do things, you can start asking. There are 6 categories of reasons, not excuses, of why people aren't performing. And you want to genuinely understand which of those 6 categories. It might be 2 or 3 of them. And if it's 2 or 3 of the categories, then I've got to find, you might have to motivate people to do things, but you might also have to provide them, increase their ability. So a lot of times the fix in an accountability conversation is a combination of motivation and ability. So going back to Corey, who wasn't getting work done, he was depressed. Well, that's an ability issue, right? And I was assuming he was just blowing me off and not a good direct report and not reliable and, all those things. Well, once we get to taking care of his depression, then we can go back and say, okay, let's look on the motivation. What can you connect to? What do you want to do? So,
Mm.
so motivation and ability are connected. And having an accountability conversation allows you to try and work through those connections in a very thoughtful way.
Well, so we've talked a lot about kind of the frameworks of how to think about this and how to be curious coming into this conversation. Would it be okay with you if we stepped back and I asked you some question about like nuts and bolts of having one of these conversations, and how and when, and because I've seen you coach me and coach other people on these conversations, and it makes such a difference to have been coached on this.
Right.
So if you don't mind, could we do that?
Absolutely.
Okay, so I want to bring it all the way back to something happens in the office. Sometimes there's a few ways to address it. You could address it on the spot, that moment. Um, and I tend to be one that like I'm not great at doing that. So that's one option. You could address it at the nearest moment where you could be in private. You could address it at the end of the day. Or I've had this from a supervisor. I've had a supervisor that we'd have a meeting, and he'd put out all these things, and you'd be left thinking, was that talking about me or was that someone else? He kind of would address it to the group,
Ooh.
but never bring it up individually. And we'd all be like, that one wasn't me. That one was definitely me. That one, you just kind of could pick through them and you're like, okay, which of these is me and which is someone else? And you left guessing on some of them. So kind of the when and the where, if you're going to have correction and accountability, how do you do it?
So I did some work with some doctors and nurses, and it was interesting because they were working in an operating room, and they had a ground rule around when to do it. And the first ground rule is if someone's safety was compromised, then having an accountability conversation didn't matter. You just told people what to do and said do it, and you moved to power, or you moved to
Sure.
you moved to threats and bribes. So, but they also had a ground rule that said, hey, things happen in the heat of the moment. All of a sudden, a patient's bleeding, the gums are bleeding, and a million things everything's going wrong that could be going wrong. You got to take care of the patient in the moment, right? You're not going to let your patient, you're not going to step aside and say, hang on while we talk about this for a minute.
Right,
It's
right.
not going to happen. But they did
So
have
if patient safety is ever at stake, that is a moment to have an immediate on the spot correction, even if it's not perfectly done. You just got to do it.
absolutely, and you're not going to use your best skills. You just make good things happen when you have to. Um, when that happens, so there were a couple of ground rules. They said when that happens, number one, you needed to have a follow-up conversation to say, how could we have handled that differently? How could we have
Mm.
managed that? And their ground rule was, hey, we're going to do what we need to do to keep patients safe and alive. But if there's an issue that comes up that doesn't go well, we'll address it in 24 hours. So they had a ground rule that they would try and address poor communication within 24 hours. Now, the nice thing about that was there was an expectation that issues got addressed in a timely manner. What people typically do is they talk themselves out of having the conversations. And in fact,
Oh yeah.
if there's a delay, the more you delay, I promise you, the more you're talking yourself and rationalizing and justifying your lack of action. So I would recommend that you set a time frame as a dentist, knowing the flow of operations and knowing what your time frame is and knowing what the time frame of everyone in your office and how busy you are, that says, we're going to address these on this type of a basis. And maybe it is 24, 48, maybe it's on a weekly basis.
Well, and here's what's coming to mind when you say that. I think if something happens during the day, to make a goal of addressing it before the end of the day, so that way you can let them know. Because I just know myself, if I don't do it that day, I'm probably not going to do it the next day. So if something happens, grab that person and say, hey, before you leave today, I just need to have a quick chat with you, and then kind of set that up as your standard, and let everyone know that, like, hey, if something occurs that we feel like we need to talk about, we want to try and address that before the end of the day, so there's not lingering questions, there's not lingering issues. So you could almost set that expectation with your team that, like, and reverse, if they have something that they feel like they've seen, they've noticed, they need to address, that by the end of the day, before you go home, grab me and let's talk about it.
Yeah, in fact, I'm glad you said that, because that was the thought that came to my mind, which was, I think you need to let your people know that you're going to make mistakes too, and you expect them to hold you accountable. So if you want a high-performing dental office, everyone has to hold everyone accountable, including people holding the dentist accountable when the dentist screws up, right? So when the doctor screws up, and you need to expect that. And in fact, I'm going to say, if people aren't pointing out your mistakes, you probably don't have a very safe environment.
You haven't created enough safety for them to feel comfortable doing that.
And once they feel comfortable doing that, anytime they point out a mistake you make, you just got to be thank you for bringing that up. That is so important. I'm so glad you brought that up. And boy, do we need to learn, and me in particular. So your reaction to people criticizing you, in large part, will determine whether they could accept having an accountability conversation. So you've got to
which is so hard to do when someone someone comes to you and corrects you on something, and there's 10 things that maybe you feel like they need to work on, and they're pointing out one little nitpicky thing. But to to turn around and thank them for that and create more safety and set a precedence of safety moving forward is way more important, I feel like, than the content of whatever they're correcting you on.
Absolutely. And not only do you agree with them, I would actually point out, how do I say this? I would make their point stronger than they're making it, right? So they bring out, say, you do this. Oh yeah, and I do this too. And sometimes I even do that. Like they need to know. Everyone makes mistakes. Every dentist makes mistakes. Every hygienist makes mistakes. Every assistant makes mistakes, and they need to know that making mistakes are a learning opportunity and not an opportunity for punishment and threat. It just happens, and if you've got that learning environment, then it feels like you're in a team together. So that's critical. So yeah,
Okay.
and I love the idea of saying, hey, by the end of the day, let's do that. One of the things then that I'm going to suggest is there needs to be a ratio of positive to negative, right? So if you know, they say the ratio is somewhere from 3 to 5 positives for every negative. So you ought to be complimenting people. If all they know is at the end of the day you're having that conversation, pretty soon they're going to walk around with PTSD saying, oh crap, I dread this meeting at the end of the day. But if they're being praised regularly and continuously, then they're going to recognize, oh, this is and these accountability conversations are learning opportunities, because they're learning opportunities for you too. They're not just learning opportunities for the people you're having the conversation with, because it might happen that a third of the time your miscommunication was the reason something went wrong. Right. Mm-hmm. And so you've got to take into consideration the fact that maybe you're the problem. In fact, I would probably go in assuming that you were the problem, not them.
And that lines up with the book Extreme Ownership by Jocko Willink, of just at the end of the day, everything falls on the leader. If you have a bad team, it's because you're a bad leader. And I'm saying it wrong, but this idea that just assuming everything is your responsibility. And if you come into these conversations trying to figure out, hey, how can I be a better leader and a better support to you? And I probably screwed something up. I'm trying to figure out what I can do better. Then they're way more likely to be honest than, hey, I noticed you didn't do this. What's the deal?
Yep. Yeah. And again, people need to know that you love them and you care about them and you care about them as a human being, and that while you're addressing the problem, they are as important as the problem. In fact, problems are just problems. People are more important than problems, and they need to feel that they're more important than the problem you're addressing.
So now we've established, we're trying to create a culture that is a culture of safety, a culture of accountability and learning in a good way. Say that someone does something wrong. Now we've said, hey, let's talk about this at the end of the day. You've set this up. How do we lead into and prep for these conversations? So there's the prep for the conversation, and then there's like the first things that you say in the conversation.
Yeah, one of the biggest things you learn about an accountability conversation is you need to step back and analyze it, kind of be detached from it. You want to be a scientist about this, and so there's a difference between being a scientist and kind of being, it's almost like Sheldon in Big Bang Theory, right? You're analytically detached from this, and you really want to genuinely understand, versus you're a business owner and they're screwing up your business, and so you've got to spend probably 5 to 10 minutes trying to detach yourself and asking yourself some really valid questions about, okay, was this motivation or ability? Were there, is it an individual issue? Is it a social issue? I asked them to get this preparation done there. Did someone else ask them to do something at the same time? Are we also asking them to multitask and do 4 different things, and they had 3 different priorities and didn't know which priority they were supposed to address in the moment? So you want to go through and you almost want to excuse them, not find excuses, but you want to go in saying, I got to find 4 or 5 good reasons why they're doing this, as opposed to they're just lazy and they don't care. So you want to be a scientist and emotionally detached, and try and come in giving them, seriously cutting them some slack, and not going in being upset or frustrated.
I think like this idea of giving yourself tools, we've talked about a lot of different reasons they could be doing stuff in the Crucial Conversations side of things, we talked about why would a reasonable, rational person do this. But creating this headspace of curiosity and is the work, because so many times we come in just coming in hot and assuming the worst about people. Fundamental attribution error, we've already talked about that. But this is where people screw up these conversations before they've ever started, and so they wonder why, and they never go well, and they always dread doing it because it happens like this over and over and over.
Yeah. And so as a dentist, do you build in a 10-minute buffer between your last patient and being able to talk to people? Can you manage your schedule in such a way that you've got a little bit of headspace at the end of the day to kind of deal with those things? So in most practices, there's something usually that goes wrong every day. And again, let me be clear. You don't want to become what I call a crucial accountability Nazi. You don't want to become a nitpicker, and you can become really annoying if every little problem you see.
Let's talk about this.
Yeah, that's not the goal or objective. What you want to do though is if you start. Let me go back to CPR. If you start dealing with patterns of things, and you start dealing with relationship issues, and things should start to improve. And the number of issues, you're getting better when the number of issues you're dealing with in your practice are going down, because people are now performing according to expectations, both from a results as well as a behavioral level. So you should start. One of the indications that you're doing a good job, as we've already talked about, is people bring up problems to you. Another is you're starting to see a pattern of a higher standard. And what you want is people. The sign of a really, really, really good dental practice or office is when they're holding each other accountable when you're not even around, right?
So they have the safety, the tools, and they care at the same level that you do, and are holding each other to that standard.
Precisely.
Dr. Paul Etchison. So I think by the time this episode airs, his episode will have already aired. He talks about grace before guilt is what he tells his team. Like,
yes,
I want you to tell me when you've made a mistake. We all make mistakes. I'm not going to guilt trip you. I'm not, it's like, we're going to figure out how to fix it. But just setting that expectation. So, okay, so we've talked about preparing and getting into that headspace. Now, how do you start? Like the actual words and the skills of how do you have this conversation and not immediately trigger defensiveness and they're being upset and frustrated and you're upset and frustrated as soon as, 1 minute into the conversation?
Well, there's kind of three pieces to an accountability conversation. The first piece is making people feel safe, it's the grace before guilt piece. It's the second piece is actually what you say, which is the content of the conversation. And the third is inviting the dialogue, inviting them to respond. So the making it safe, people will respond to you if they believe you're 100% committed to their success and 100% that you respect them. So you need to verbalize something that says something to that effect. Boy, I sure value you as a team member, and I know how hard you work and how we overscheduled things, and this was I know this was a crazy day, and I want to thank you for hanging in there and being part of the team and making it to the end. So they need to feel some type of validation for who they are, that as a person, and that you're committed to their success. Then you just jump in and you describe what was expected versus what we call it the gap. An accountability conversation is a gap. What we expected to happen and what actually happened. I expected this to occur 3 times and it didn't occur, right? So, or I expected this at this moment and it came 7 minutes later. And you want to be very factual. So describe what was expected versus what was observed. And then you can even add in a little bit of interpretation. If you think you know why it happened, particularly if it's a pattern or relationship issue, you need to add in a little bit of interpretation. Kind of like when this woman said to her husband, "Honey, I don't think you're a good husband, and I don't think you're capable of being a good husband or capable of being a good father." So you may have to just call a spade a spade. If you see a pattern, talk about the pattern. If you see a trust issue, with Corey, I said, I'm beginning to wonder if you're telling me what I want to hear in the moment, and then hoping, and then doing something that you had planned otherwise. What you don't want to say is, I'm beginning to wonder if you're lying to me, or if you're telling me the truth or being honest. Those are going to trigger them. But you want to describe what you're seeing in a very positive yet totally 100% candid way. And then you want to ask, so how do you see it? Ask them, what's your perspective? What happened? You're going to invite the dialogue. Then the other piece of the accountability conversation is then to pop what we call the diagnostic question. Was it too hard? Was it impossible? Or was it just not that important? It's the motivation versus ability. Did you not want to do it, or were you unable to do it?
Okay, so let me see if I can summarize a little bit of this back, and maybe we can do some good examples and bad examples of each. Um, so you said the first thing is creating safety, um, and demonstrating that you're committed to their success and that you care about them. That's step number one. So creating kind of a safe space. Step number two is factually describing the gap between what was expected and their actual performance. And then step number three is providing some interpretation of like, this makes me think this, this, and this, and this. And then asking a question of, you know, is it this, or this? Is the reason behind this an ability, a motivation, or something else? And so let's go back and talk about the safety piece. First off, was that correct as a summary, more or less?
Absolutely. And yeah, let's talk and let's go back to, let's use the example of someone who comes in late, literally, 5 times a week, or 3 to 5 times a week, right? We'll use that as an example.
Okay. So to lay down that safety, what would be the wrong way to do it, and what would be the right way to do it?
Well, the wrong way to do it is to say the same thing every time, and to fake it. And so you have to genuinely think about, why is this person valuable to our practice? And sometimes you have to go back to, why did I hire this person in the first place? Or, what's one or two desirable things that I like about them? So, you've got someone who comes in late. What you don't want to say is, "Hey, I just want you to know I love you to pieces." If that's not, if that's not the way you feel,
Right. Don't be schmarmy for schmarmy's sake, and kind of shoot it before it even started.
yeah. But you might want to say to this person, "Hey, I noticed that you are a great coworker. Everyone else, when you work, everyone else in the office really seems to enjoy working with you and feel better after they work with you." Something like that. And again, it requires a little bit of time to figure out what you need to say in the moment that matters, that makes sense. That you have to see it and have some evidence, and then you'd say, I've noticed over the last 3 weeks that you come in. We started our huddle at 6:45, and you've been in at after 7 o'clock about 3 out of 5 times, right?
Hmm.
And
So that was important because it was factual and there was no emotion or judgment.
yeah, I didn't say you were late, right? I didn't say you're late. I said,
Interesting. You didn't even say. I didn't even catch that you didn't say that.
I didn't say you're late. I said we started 6:45 and you've arrived after 7. So I'm trying to be as dispassionate. This is like Sheldon on Big Bang Theory. I'm just trying to be factual
Right.
and describe, right? And then I'm probably going to add it. I'm beginning to wonder if our early starting time is a challenge for you. So tell me what's going on.
Okay. So and the factual part, I think that's really hard to do. I think that is where a lot of people get tripped up. Is they didn't create the safety, and then they come in with kind of judgment or accusation laced into the facts.
Yep.
Do you have any other further tools or tips to like, separate all of that, or am I beating a dead horse here?
No. So here's the difference between facts and judgments and that really are frustrating to people. It's factual if I could tell 10 people what it is and they would know exactly what it is. If I said you came in late and I told 10 people what that is, they wouldn't know what that looked like.
Mm.
So pretend like you're describing it to a third party who's objective and say, would they understand that? Is that understandable to a third party who knows nothing about dentistry, knows nothing about my practice? Could they understand that? And if they can understand that, then you're probably down to facts. If they can't, and if there's any interpretation in there, then you're probably going to make them defensive. They're probably going to shut down.
Well, and if you tell someone they're late, they could say, "Well, I'm not that late. Like, I was only 2 minutes late," or in their mind, half an hour late is a lot late, so 15 minutes doesn't feel that late to them. Um, so they can. I think it's so much harder to argue with. It just sets the stage. So, anyways, we've talked about that. So, now the how do you mentioned earlier, I said the word but when I was trying to do this, and you said it's important to use the word and that seems like such a small thing, but this seems really important when you're moving from the facts to then some of your interpretations to use that word and. Why is that important?
Because but is another way of saying I'm going to negate. A lot of times people will say, "Hey, you're a great coworker. You make everyone happy, but," and you've just negated everything you just said. It's like a but is an automatic eraser. Erase all the good things I just said, and now I'm going to slam you for what I really think.
Hmm.
In fact, I had a colleague of mine who said, "But" is an acronym, which means behold the underlying truth that I really wanted to tell you, right? I sometimes tell people just get the "but" out of your mouth and either pause. If you need to, if you talk about someone positively and then either pause and start into the next piece, the accountability piece, or say "and." So use "and" or use a pause, but don't use a "but" because they
It's so interesting because you could do all the work really well. You could lay the psychological safety, you could describe the facts, describe the gap, and then throw it all out with a single but.
You could, and so part of an accountability. So the art of accountability conversation is watching how people react. Because if they're safe, then they'll open up to you, and if they're not, then we probably need to have another conversation around how do I deal with defensiveness? How do I deal with people that do what's the next level of dynamics around motivation and ability and defensiveness? We certainly probably can't get into that here, but we certainly could in another call.
Sure.
So yeah, I mean, this is just the beginning, and 9 times out of 10, if not, no, probably 75% of the time, if you start really well, you're going to end really well. Another 25% of the time, it doesn't. You need more skill. You need more um, in the moment, verbal judo, verbal gymnastics, verbal acuity, and really understanding where people are coming from and being able to pull them in a way where they know you care about them. That requires a lot of skill.
So I think you know the interesting thing about all of this is that there is these two halves of this where there's the heart and the preparation and your intent, and there's the skill and the words and how you phrase things. And you've said before that if you get the heart piece right, even if you're not perfect at the judo, at the skills, it's going to go better for you than if you never even worked on the heart issue or you didn't come to it with kind of the right attitude. Um, and then on the flip side, the judo is when you're dealing with stuff that is really important. It is a true crucial conversation, and emotions are running high. How to bring people back to safety. So even if you started well or you didn't start perfectly and they got triggered, they're defensive, and then that triggers you, and you're kind of going back and forth, things are escalating. Um, that's where being really experienced and having a lot of tools in your belt, and the training that Crucial Conversations and Crucial Accountability provides really comes to bear is how to save even those conversations. Despite all of this, though, would you say there's still sometimes where um, people really just don't care or they do blow up? And it's like you can learn all of this, and does it still not work sometimes?
Oh, for sure. Um, so I do a lot of leadership work, and one of the pieces in leadership, we assess where people are developmentally in their developmental stage, and I think the data suggests that about 1 out of 20 people are not adults emotionally; they're still teenagers emotionally.
Hmm.
Um, that said, you're like your ability to deal with teenagers increases exponentially when you use your best skills. When you don't use good skills, you'll fail every time with teenagers, right? Um,
Right.
but if you use your best skills, so all's these skills do is they increase your batting average. They increase your success rate to but you're not gonna get everyone all the time. And the fun part about the accountability conversations, however, is that if you screw up and if it doesn't go well, you can go back and say, okay, what happened? Did they not feel safe? Did I not express it right? You can actually do a post-mortem, an autopsy. I killed that. And you can figure out what to do differently next time. So there are kind of levels and layers, and you can always go back. And a robust model or framework not only works when it succeeds, but it also works when it fails, because then you can go back and correct. You can use that as a correcting mechanism too.
So we had talked about maybe opening this up if people have questions about this, or if they have an upcoming conversation where they know they need to hold a team member accountable, or they had a recent conversation where it didn't go well, that maybe they could send us that information. So my question is, and we could talk about it on an episode, what information would you need from them to make that most useful? So if someone was like, hey, I need to work on this, I've got a specific situation, but we need all the information, I guess not all the information, but we need more information to be able to make the conversation more useful to them. What would you ask that they kind of give us in terms of information?
And I would love to do it. It'd be lots of fun, because I actually think real conversations are better than talking about it, what we're doing here. Much more learning for sure. I would want to have some backstory around, what's the backstory, what's the situation, circumstances. And then I would need to know exactly what that person said who was trying to have the accountability conversation, and what the other person said, along with. So I would want to have the indications of communications, both verbal and nonverbal. So I'd want, here's what was said, here is my verbal messages, and non-verbally, maybe here's what I said, and the other person, how did they respond? What was their verbal and nonverbal? So if we get the verbal and nonverbal communications along with the backstory and the situation, I think we got plenty to go on.
Cool. So that would be for a postmortem. Obviously, if you've got a upcoming scenario and you can describe it to us, including the backstory, and maybe would you need like any attempts in the past of like trying to hold this person accountable and how that went?
Sure.
Would that be helpful moving forward?
That's a good backstory. And even if someone came on, I'm going to be happy to do it live. Be happy to let's play this out, right? Let's if we do a 3-way live broadcast, or if be happy to say, okay, what are you going to do? And we'll start with, okay, what's the baseline? How would you approach this? And then we'll go in and dissect and say, okay, how do you think this will go? That will go. So yeah, that would be great. So having any past attempts, and communication is so personal, and every person is so different. So just enough. We need enough to know kind of what are the dynamics around this communication for both you and the other person, and then what was actually expressed or is going to be expressed to be able to move forward.
Cool. No, and this is perfect because we have done with Practice Underwater, we've done a lot of anonymous interviews where we've brought on someone and we've talked about really difficult things. So we have the capability to do the same thing here. If someone wants to talk about this and doesn't want that team member to eventually find out, or whatever, we can leave the name out, we can change your voice, we can just leave specific names and details out so people couldn't figure it out. But I really appreciate it. I think it'd be a ton of fun, and we'll have details. I'll do a little outro here and include details of the logistics of, if you want to do that, how to reach out to us, and then we can go from there. So this was a blast. It's always so fun to me to see now as an adult the skills that I mocked as a teenager and valuing them and everything that you've done and taught for all these years.
Well, you weren't the only child that mocked them.
All four of us had our fair amount of it.
And maybe you see more value in others. So maybe the amount of mockery and the amount of value, maybe those might be commensurate. But
I think you have to suffer through doing it wrong first before you then value it and be like, oh, I guess maybe Dad was right.
Well, and one of the reasons you mock it is because I used it on you guys, and I wasn't always perfect. I mean, the nice thing about these skills is you can screw up, and then you can learn how to do it better. So we
were the test subjects.
You were the that's right. You were the lab rats, and so you had lots of good reason to mock it. And there are many people who run practices who still want to focus on the systems and processes and, all the analysis and procedures, and don't want to focus on this side of practice. And you can get so much doing that, but I think you leave stuff on the table by not also focusing on the human element.
Well, and just to wrap it, I mean, Howard Friend talks about a team that, or a doctor that has a team that turns over every 3 to 4 years, versus a doctor that has a team that's been there for 20 years, and how that's a completely different culture. And I think this is the piece. This is the hardest part of running a practice, is dealing with issues as they come up, performance issues, personality issues, accountability issues. And so rather than run away from this and rather than struggle with this your entire career, it's worth it to invest in learning how to do this better, thinking about this, practicing this. Because if you can get really good at this, then the thing that was the most stressful, you have a lot of skill around, and it becomes, number one, less stressful, and you get better results across the board.
Yeah, it actually becomes, instead of a weakness, it becomes a strength, right? And it becomes an enabler for you to attract the best people, and it gives you opportunities, gives you options to grow. Okay, now that I've got this, I got this high performing team. I can decide, oh, maybe I like this, and I just want to put it in cruise mode. Or now that I've done this, maybe there's other things I can do, as opposed to always being behind the 8 ball, having to do with personnel and people issues.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. Really enjoyed this, and we'll talk again soon. Thanks, Dad.
Thanks, Richard. Really appreciate it.
Awesome. Take care.
Bye now.
Okay, I hope you guys really enjoyed that interview with Murray Low. This is an area where there's so much potential for growth, and these moments in your practice of accountability are stressful, and these crucial conversations are stressful. And if you have a tool set to come out on the other side with better results, better relationships, it's not that it's now just automatically easy and the stress is all gone, but at least there's hope, and when these things come up, you've got a skill set to fall back on. So really hope you enjoyed this. Thank you guys for listening, and we will talk with you next week on the Shared Practices podcast. I'm excited to announce a partnership with Sandy Pardue. We are rebooting the Dental Drill Bits podcast. Sandy and I sat down and said, what if we did a podcast together? What if we did a whole season of your show together? And it works out perfectly because I have a ton of questions and she has a ton of answers. So we combined my skill at asking questions but not necessarily knowing the answer, and her skill at answering every single question with a wealth of knowledge, specific examples, and experience. If you want to get your dental practice organized, if you have trouble with understanding the roles and the functions and the systems of your office, join us every Tuesday on the Dental Drill Bits podcast.